The dragons found her on the same night. Their queen took her final breath. And even now, 17 years later, no one on the mountain could agree on what that meant. Snow had fallen sideways that night, driven by a wind so sharp it cracked the old pines along the eastern ridge. The dragon elders were gathered around their dying queen in the deep stone hall beneath the mountain's peak, watching the last light fade from her eyes, when a young sentry burst in from the storm with something wrapped in his wings. He said he had heard crying at the gate. He said he almost hadn't stopped to look. Inside the bundle was a human infant, no more than a few days old, her skin nearly blue from the cold, her small fists still curled tight, as if she were holding on to something no one could see. The queen, with what little breath remained in her, looked at the child for a long moment. Then she said something none of the elders expected. She said the child was to be protected, not studied, not questioned, protected, as if the word itself were a debt already owed. She died before she could explain why. For 17 years, that unfinished sentence had hung over the mountain like smoke that never quite cleared. Now the girl stood at the edge of the high cliffs where the dragons trained their young, watching the sun rise over a kingdom that had never once welcomed her. Her name was Wren, a name the guardian had given her because it belonged to no one important, and therefore could not offend anyone by being carried by a human. She had grown up among scales and firelight instead of bedtime stories and human laughter. She had learned to read the shifting moods of a dragon's tale before she had learned to read her own letters. And she had spent every single day of her life waiting for someone to finally explain why she was here at all. No one ever had. The guardian who raised her, an ancient dragon named Thal whose scales had long since dulled to the color of river stone, was the closest thing to family she had ever known. He did not speak often, and when he did, his words carried the weight of something carefully chosen. It was Thal who had argued for her life on the night she was found, when half the council wanted her left for the wolves. It was Thal who had taught her to fly, clinging to his back before she could walk in a straight line. And it was Thal who now stood beside her on the cliff, silent, watching the same sunrise, carrying whatever truth he had carried for 17 years without once setting it down. She had learned not to ask him directly. He always found a way to answer without answering. Below them, in the stone amphitheater carved into the mountain's belly, the council was already gathering. Wren could see them from here, dark shapes settling onto their perches like judges taking their seats before a trial that hadn't been announced yet. She felt her stomach tighten. Council meetings rarely concerned her. Today, for reasons no one had explained, this one did. Thal exhaled slowly, a thin plume of smoke curling from his nostrils into the cold morning air. "They will ask you to leave the mountain," he said. The words landed harder than she expected, though some quiet part of her had been bracing for them for years. She had always known this peace was borrowed. Dragons did not raise human children out of sentiment. There had to be a reason, and reasons, she had learned, eventually came due. "Why now?" she asked. Thal's eyes, old and gold and unreadable, moved toward the horizon rather than toward her. "Because there is no queen," he said. "There's been no queen since the night we found you. The council has waited as long as tradition allows. They believe it is time to choose a new one from among the dragon bloodlines that remain. And I'm in the way of that. You are a reminder that the bloodline nearly ended." Thal said, "Some creatures do not forget what reminds them of their own fear." She looked down at the gathering council, at shapes she had known her entire life, suddenly looking like strangers preparing to vote her out of the only home she had ever had. Somewhere in that crowd was Carrick, a broad-shouldered noble with silver-tipped wings, who had never once looked at her without something like disgust behind his eyes. She had always assumed it was simple prejudice. Now, watching him speak low and quick to two younger council members, she wondered for the first time if it was something else, something closer to fear. "They can't just send me away," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "No," Thal agreed, "not easily, not without breaking a law older than this mountain." Something in the way he said it made her turn to face him fully. Thal so rarely offered more than what was asked of him, and yet here he was, offering a thread before she had even reached for it. "What law?" she asked. For a long moment, the wind was the only sound between them, sweeping cold and clean across the cliff's edge. Then Thal turned his great head toward her, and in his ancient eyes she saw something she had never once seen there before in 17 years of searching for it. "Hope, there is a way you could still stand where a queen once stood," he said quietly. "It has not been used in 1,000 years. It was never meant to be used by a human. But the words of the law do not say it cannot be." Below them, the council began to call her name. The council chamber smelled of old stone and older smoke, a scent Wren had known her whole life, but had never once stood beneath, while every eye in the room turned toward her at once. She climbed the worn steps at the center of the amphitheater with Thal close behind her, his presence the only steady thing in a room suddenly full of shifting wings and lowered voices. The council members were arranged in a wide half-circle carved into the mountain rock centuries before she was born, and from their perches they watched her the way one might watch a storm arrive from a great distance, uncertain whether to prepare for it or simply hope it changed direction. Carrick spoke first, as she had known he would. "The girl does not belong at the center of this discussion," he said, his voice carrying easily across the stone. "She belongs at the edge of it, if she belongs in this hall at all." A murmur rolled through the gathered dragons. Not quite agreement, not quite objection. Wren kept her chin level and her hands still at her sides, though her heart was beating hard enough that she wondered if the dragons closest to her could hear it. "The bloodline of queens is ended," Carrick continued. "We all grieve that. But grief does not change what must happen next. A new queen must be chosen from among us. And this human's presence here only delays a decision that has already waited 17 years too long." It was Thal who answered, and when he spoke, the chamber went quieter than Wren had ever heard it. "There is a law that says otherwise," he said. Carrick's wings shifted, a small, sharp motion that betrayed more than he likely intended. "There is no such law." "There is," Thal said, "written before either of us drew breath, in the age when the first queen still remembered why the crown was given rather than simply inherited. The trials of the old queens were never limited to dragon blood. They were limited only to worthiness. The law does not ask what a candidate is. It asks what a candidate is willing to become." The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, some outraged, some curious, a few strangely, cautiously hopeful. Wren stood in the center of it, feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted without warning, revealing a door she never knew existed. An older council member, a pale-scaled dragon named Asa, who had rarely spoken to Wren in all her years on the mountain, raised a wing for silence. When the noise settled, she studied Wren for a long moment with eyes that seemed to weigh far more than curiosity. "You wish to attempt the trials," Asa said. It was not quite a question. Wren glanced at Thal. He gave no signal, no nod, no encouragement. This decision, she understood, had to be entirely her own, or would mean nothing at all. "Yes," she said. The word left her before she had fully decided to say it. And yet the moment it did, something settled in her chest that felt strangely like relief. Carrick laughed, short and humorless. 3 trials meant to test the worth of a queen, attempted by a creature who could not even breathe fire. This is not tradition. This is a mockery of it. "Then let the trials prove you right," Asa said calmly, "or prove you wrong. Either way, the law will have been honored, and no one in this hall will be able to claim otherwise." The council could not argue with that, though several clearly wished to. After a long and grudging silence, it was agreed Wren would be permitted to attempt the 3 trials of the old queens, beginning with the turn of the next moon. Should she fail any one of them, she would leave the mountain and never return. Should she somehow complete all 3, the crown itself would decide what came next. As the council dispersed, wings unfolding and voices fading into the tunnels beyond the chamber, Wren felt Thal's presence settle beside her once more, steady as always. "You didn't tell me how difficult these trials would be," she said quietly. "Difficult enough that no dragon has attempted them in 1,000 years, Thal admitted. Difficult enough that some who tried did not survive the attempt." She should have felt fear at that. Instead, standing in the chamber where her fate had just been decided by a law older than memory, she felt something closer to purpose, sharp and clean, and entirely her own for the first time in her life. The first trial, Thal explained as they walked from the hall, was a test of courage, though not the kind found in battle. It required her to fly alone into the hollow peaks, a region of the mountain range so treacherous that even seasoned dragons avoided it, and retrieve a single stone from its deepest cavern before sundown. It was there, 3 days later, standing at the edge of a canyon that dropped into darkness, so complete it seemed to swallow the daylight itself, that she met Farron. He was young for a dragon, his scales a deep and unfinished blue, and he was very clearly not supposed to be anywhere near the hollow peaks either. He was perched awkwardly on a narrow ledge below the canyon's rim, one wing bent at an angle that made her stomach turn, watching her with an expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and desperation. "If you're here to laugh," he called up to her, his voice cracking slightly on the words, "please make it quick. I don't have all day to be humiliated." Wren did not laugh. She climbed down to the ledge instead, moving carefully along a seam of rock barely wide enough for her boots, until she reached the young dragon and could see the true damage to his wing. It was not broken, she guessed, but badly strained, twisted in a fall he had clearly not meant to take. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "Same thing you are, probably," Farron said, wincing as he shifted his weight. "Proving something. I just didn't plan on proving it from the bottom of a canyon," he explained between careful breaths. They had come to Hollow Peaks chasing his own foolish idea of courage, hoping to earn some respect from a council that had never taken him seriously. He had misjudged a downdraft near the canyon wall and struck the rock hard enough to knock the wind and the confidence both clean out of him. He had been stranded on the ledge for the better part of a day. Wren knew she should keep moving. The sun was already sliding toward the western ridge, and the trial demanded she reach the deepest cavern and return before it set. But something in Farron's voice, that particular flavor of loneliness dressed up as sarcasm, was uncomfortably familiar to her. She helped him to his feet instead, bracing his weight against her shoulder, and together they made slow, difficult progress along the canyon wall toward a wider outcropping where he could rest safely until help arrived. By the time she left him there, promising to send word to the mountain the moment she returned, the light had thinned considerably, and the deep cavern still waited far below. She ran the rest of the way. The cavern, when she finally reached it, was not what she expected. She had imagined darkness and danger, teeth in the shadows, some test of nerve built from fear. Instead, she found silence, and at its center, resting on a pedestal of pale stone, a single black stone no larger than her palm, warm to the touch despite the cold air around it. She picked it up, and for reasons she could not explain, felt something like recognition pass through her, as though the stone had been waiting specifically for her hand and no other. She made it back to Mountain's Gate just as the last edge of sun slipped below the horizon, breathless, her boots torn, the black stone clutched tight in her fist. The council's reaction was mixed, as she had come to expect. Asa examined the stone with something close to satisfaction. Carrick examined Wren herself, his eyes narrowed, searching for some flaw in her victory he could hold up as proof this had all been a mistake. He found nothing to say, not publicly, and that silence seemed to cost him more than any argument would have. That night, exhausted and aching in ways she hadn't felt since her earliest years of flight training, Wren couldn't sleep. She told herself it was a stone, its strange faint warmth still lingering in her palm even after she'd set aside. In truth, it was something else, a restlessness that had followed her since the council chamber, a sense that the mountain, for all its familiar stone and shadow, was holding its breath around her. She left her quarters near midnight, meaning only to walk the upper terraces until her mind settled. That was how she came to be crouched behind a broken pillar near the old western archway, close enough to hear two voices she recognized instantly and had never expected to hear together. Carrick's voice, low and clipped, and beneath it, unmistakably, the voice of a human. She had not seen another human since she was old enough to remember faces. The sound of one now, speaking quietly in the dark corridors of a mountain that belonged to dragons, sent a cold thread of unease down her spine. "She won't fail the trials," Carrick was saying, frustration sharpening every word. "Not without guiding her. We need another approach." "Approaches cost patience," the human replied. His voice was calm, almost amused, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. "And patience is something my employer has very little of. He wants the mountain's heartstone before winter turns, girl or no girl sitting on the throne. The heartstone is not something I can simply hand over." "No," the man agreed, "but a distracted council, arguing over an unworthy queen. might not notice it missing until it's far too late to matter. Wren pressed herself flatter against the cold stone, her pulse loud in her own ears. She understood only pieces of what she was hearing, but the pieces fit together in a shape that frightened her far more than any canyon or cavern ever could. Carrig was not simply opposed to her. He was working with someone from beyond the mountain, someone with plans for something called the Heartstone, someone willing to use her trials as cover for it. She could step out now. She could demand answers, drag Carrig before the council, force this into the light before it went any further. But she had no proof beyond her own ears, no witness beside herself. And she was, as Carrig himself had said only hours ago in that very chamber, a human the council had barely agreed to tolerate. If she accused one of their own without evidence, she would hand him exactly the excuse he needed to have her removed from the mountain before the second trial ever began. So she stayed hidden, and she stayed silent, and she let the two voices finish their quiet business and fade back into the dark corridors of the mountain, telling herself she was choosing patience. It did not feel like patience. It felt, as she made her way back to her quarters beneath a sky full of cold and indifferent stars, like the first mistake of many still waiting to be made. Word of scouts near the eastern foothills reached the mountain 3 days later, carried by a trembling messenger from a village that sat at the base of the range, a small human settlement that had lived in uneasy peace with the dragons for generations, trading grain and iron for protection from the raiders who occasionally tested the mountain's borders. The scouts, the messenger said, wore no colors anyone recognized, and they had been seen studying the old watchtowers with far too much interest for simple travelers. Wren heard the report standing at the edge of the council chamber, uninvited but not turned away, and felt the conversation from the western archway settle over her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She had told no one what she'd overheard. Not thou, not Asa, no one. Every day that passed without proof felt like a debt quietly accumulating against her. The second trial had been set for that very afternoon, a test the elders called the Trial of Wisdom, held in the mountain's ancient library, where she would be asked to recover a lost teaching from the age of the first queens using nothing but riddles left behind by dragons long dead. She had spent the better part of 2 weeks preparing for it. And now, standing amid a council distracted by talk of foreign scouts and a village suddenly nervous about its safety, she wondered if the trial would even proceed at all. It did, though barely. She was midway through the library's lower archive, tracing her fingers along a shelf of stone tablets, searching for the third riddle's answer, when the mountain's warning horn split the afternoon into panic. She reached the outer terrace in time to see smoke rising from the village below, thin gray columns bending sideways in the wind, and beneath them, small figures running between burning storehouses, while a line of armed men pushed steadily deeper into the settlement's narrow streets. The council's response was immediate and, to Wren's eyes, agonizingly slow, dragons gathering in formation along the ridge, debating strategy while the smoke thickened below. She did not wait for them to finish debating. She found Farron near the eastern perch, his wing healed enough now to bear weight again, and asked him the only question that mattered. "Can you fly?" "Better than I could last week," he said, already spreading the wing to prove it, though she caught the flicker of pain crossing his face as he did. "Why?" "Because people are dying down there while we argue about riddles." He didn't hesitate. She climbed onto his back the way Thel had taught her years before, and together they dropped off the ridge into open air, the wind tearing past them as the burning village rose up to meet them far faster than caution would have liked. They came in low over the main street, just as one of the raiders raised a torch toward the granary that held the village's entire winter grain store. Farron's roar scattered the man before the torch ever touched wood, and Wren slid from his back into the chaos below, pulling a terrified family from a collapsing doorway, guiding an old man with a cane toward the safety of the eastern well, where the fires hadn't yet reached. It was there, helping the old man settle against the well's stone rim, that she came face to face with one of the raiders directly, a broad man with a scar across his jaw who looked at her with an expression of genuine surprise, as though a human standing calmly among dragons was stranger to him than the dragons themselves. "You're the one," he said, more to himself than to her. "The girl in the trials." Before she could answer, he lunged, and only Farron's sudden dive between them, wings snapping wide to knock the man off his feet, kept her from finding out exactly what he intended. The raider scrambled up and fled into the smoke rather than face a dragon at close range, But his final words trailed back over his shoulder, sharp enough to cut through the noise of the burning street. He said you'd be a problem. She had no time to ask who he meant. More raiders were pressing toward the well, and Wren, exhausted and wounded, was beginning to falter in the smoke-thick air. Wren pulled the old man and the family further back, shouting directions toward a mountain path, buying time she wasn't sure they had. That was when the ground gave slightly beneath her boots, a section of old stone wall crumbling from the heat, and she found herself surrounded before she fully understood what had happened. 3 raiders closing in from different angles, while Wren, pinned by 2 more near the granary, could not reach her in time. She had no weapon. She had never needed one. Not on the mountain. Not in a life spent among creatures who had always, in their own difficult way, protected her. The nearest raider raised his blade, and for one long, suspended second, Wren understood with total clarity that the mountain's help, and Wren's help, and every trial she had passed so carefully, might not matter at all if the single moment went the wrong way. Then the sky above the well went dark, not with smoke, but with wings, dozens of them, as the council that had argued so long finally arrived in full force, scattering the raiders like leaves before a gale. Thal himself landed between Wren and the blade a heartbeat before it fell, his massive form driving the raider back with nothing more than the force of his presence. The village was saved before the sun fully set, the raiders driven back into the foothills they'd come from, though not without cost. Wren lay exhausted near the granary, his healing wings strained badly enough to need days more rest. 3 homes had burned to nothing, and when Wren finally climbed back up the mountain path beside Thal, her hand still trembling from the raider's blade, she had come within inches of meeting. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something she had found on the ground near the well in the chaos, something a fleeing raider had dropped without noticing. A folded piece of parchment, sealed with wax bearing a crest she didn't recognize, and beneath the broken seal, a single line of careful handwriting that made her stomach turn cold the moment she read it. The traitor inside the mountain has been paid. Proceed as planned. She showed the parchment to Thal that same night, in the quiet of his chamber where the firelight softened the hard lines of worry on his ancient face. He read it twice, slowly, then set it down with a care that told her more than words could have. You suspected someone, he said. It wasn't a question. She told him everything then, the voices behind the western archway, Carrick's clipped frustration, the human who spoke of a heartstone and patience running thin, the days she'd spent saying nothing, because she had no proof and no standing to accuse a member of the council. Thal listened without interrupting, and when she finished, his silence stretched long enough that she began to wonder if she had made a mistake in staying quiet for so long. You should have told me, he said finally, though there was no anger in it, only a tiredness that seemed to settle deeper into his old bones. But I understand why you didn't. This mountain has never made it easy for you to trust that your word would be believed over his. The council was called before dawn. Wren stood at its center once more, the parchment in her hand, and watched Carrick's face as Thal read the raider's message aloud to the gathered elders. For one brief moment, something flickered behind Carrick's eyes, something that looked almost like fear before hardened back into practiced indignation. A scrap of parchment found in the chaos of an attack proves nothing, Carrick said. Perhaps it proves only that someone wishes to see me disgraced before the girls' trials are finished. It might have worked. If Asa hadn't quietly produced a second piece of evidence, a merchant's ledger discovered that very morning showing payments routed through a trading contact known to deal in mountain minerals, a contact whose name matched letters Carrick himself had signed. The council chamber went very still. Carrick's composure did not so much crack as simply stop being maintained, his wings settling low, his eyes finding the floor rather than the dragons around him. He did not confess outright. He didn't need to. The silence did that for him. But before the council could decide what to do with him, Carrick raised his head one final time, and when he spoke, his voice was aimed not at the elders but directly at Wren, quiet and precise, clearly meant to wound. You want to know why you were really left at our gate, he said. Ask your guardian why the old queen's dying wish was to protect a child that dragon lost that should have been left in the snow. Ask him what price was paid that night to keep you alive, and whether it was ever truly a kindness at all. The chamber erupted, elders shouting for Carrick to be silent, Asa moving to physically restrain him, but Wren barely heard any of it. She was looking at Thal, and Thal, for the first time in 17 years, could not meet her eyes. "What is he talking about?" she asked. Thal's silence was answer enough to break something in her chest that she hadn't realized was still so fragile after all these years of pretending she'd made peace with not knowing. "Not now," Thal said quietly. "Not like this. You deserve to hear it properly, when there's time to explain it fully, not thrown at you as a weapon in a council chamber." "You had 17 years to explain it properly," she said, and her voice cracked in a way she hated, in front of a room full of dragons who already doubted whether she belonged among them at all. 17 years, and every time I asked, you found a way to say nothing. She didn't wait for his answer. She turned and walked out of the chamber, past elders who didn't know whether to stop her, past Kara being led away under guard, out into the cold morning air where the wind at least had the decency to be honest about how sharp it could cut. She found Farron near the eastern perch, still healing, still watching the mountain with the quiet patience of someone who had learned to wait out other people's storms. He didn't ask what happened. He simply moved aside so she could sit beside him and let the silence between them be the kind that didn't demand anything from her. "I don't know if I want to finish the trials," she admitted finally, staring out at the foothills where smoke had only just stopped rising 2 days before. "What's the point of earning a crown from people who've been lying to me since the night I was born?" Farron considered that for a long moment before answering, his voice careful in a way that suggested he'd thought about this longer than the question itself had existed. "Thal raised you when the entire council wanted you gone," he said. "He taught you to fly. He argued for your life before you were old enough to understand what your life even was. Whatever he hasn't told you, whatever reason he's had for the silence, I don't think it was ever about not loving you enough to explain it." "Then why?" "Because some truths take 17 years to become safe to say out loud," Farron said. "Maybe he was still waiting for you to be strong enough to hear it and not break." She wanted to argue with that, wanted to hold on to the anger a little longer, because the anger was easier than the grief underneath it. But sitting there beside a dragon who had trusted her enough to let her carry him down into a burning village, she felt the sharpest edge of that anger begin, slowly, to dull. The third trial waited 2 days away. She still didn't know if she would attempt it. The warning horn sounded again the following night, sharper and more urgent than it had for the raiders. And this time when Wren reached the outer terrace, what she saw stealing across the foothills in the moonlight was not a scattered band of raiders, but an army, ranks of torches stretching back into the dark farther than she could count, moving steadily toward the mountain's base. Thal found her there, and for the first time since the council chamber, they stood together without either of them speaking of what had been said. There wasn't time for it now. "That's him," Thal said quietly, watching the torches. "The one Carrick sold us to. He's tired of waiting." The council scrambled into formation faster than they had for the raiders, every dragon on the mountain taking to the ridge. But even Wren could see the math working against them. This was not a village raid to be broken up and chased off. This was a small war arriving at their gate, and the mountain, for all its ancient strength, had not fought a war in generations. She found herself moving before she'd fully decided to, running not toward the safety of the upper caverns, but down toward the village path, where she knew the human settlers would be gathering their children and their elderly, uncertain whether to trust dragon wings to protect them or their own 2 feet to carry them away. Wren. Thal's voice, close behind her, carrying an urgency she'd rarely heard from him. The third trial. It was meant to be attempted in stillness, in reflection, a test of what you're willing to sacrifice for crown. This is not that. Then maybe the trial was never really about a quiet room and old riddles, she said, not slowing. Maybe it was always going to be about this. She reached the village to find exactly the panic she'd expected. Humans and a handful of dragons stationed there trying to organize an evacuation that kept collapsing into chaos every time the horizon lit up with another line of torches. She didn't have Thal's authority or Osa's wisdom or even Farron's raw courage. What she had was 17 years of understanding both worlds well enough to speak to each of them, and for the first time in her life, she used it without hesitation, organizing the humans into evacuation lines toward the eastern caves while directing the young dragons to carry the elderly and the wounded in relays, dragon and human moving together in a rhythm neither species had ever needed to find before. It was working slowly, painfully, when the first wave of the warlord soldiers broke through the village's outer fence. The fighting that followed was not the clean, distant battle Wren had imagined wars might look like from the safety of the mountain's high terraces. It was close and frightened and full of ordinary people doing their best not to die. Dragons shielding fleeing families with their own bodies. Soldiers who had clearly been promised riches for a mountain's worth of heartstone, finding instead a defense fiercer than they'd been told to expect. Carrick appeared near the granary in the middle of it, freed somehow in the chaos, and for one terrible moment Wren thought he had come to finish what his betrayal started. Instead, she watched him throw himself between a falling wall and two human children too frightened to move, taking away the collapsing stone across his own back rather than let it fall on them. Whatever else he was, whatever he had done, the sight of it complicated something in her that she didn't have time to examine. She found Thal at the height of the battle, standing between the village and a line of advancing soldiers, holding ground that no single dragon should have been able to hold alone. She ran to the side without thinking, and together they pushed the line back toward the tree line. Thal's strength and her own steady direction somehow working as one thing rather than two. It was there in the last true push of the battle that a soldier broke past their guard entirely, blade raised toward Wren's unprotected side, and Thal moved the only way he could, placing himself fully between the blade and the girl he had raised since the night she was found crying in the snow. The blade found him instead of her. He fell hard, and the sound he made hitting the ground was smaller than a creature his size should have been capable of making, more human somehow. Full of pain he'd clearly been hiding for years beneath a calm he'd never once let crack in front of her. The soldier who struck him didn't survive the moment after, though Wren would never quite remember how that happened. Only that she was kneeling in the mud beside Thal's massive head a heartbeat later, her hands pressed uselessly against a wound too large for any pressure to help. Around them, the tide of the battle was finally turning, the warlord's forces breaking and scattering as reinforcements from the mountain arrived at last, but none of it mattered to Wren in that moment. None of it reached past the sound of Thal's slowing breath and the desperate, useless words she kept repeating, telling him to hold on, telling him she wasn't ready, telling him there was still so much she didn't know. Thal's eyes found hers, clouded but still achingly familiar, still full of the same patient love she had never once doubted, whatever else she hadn't understood. "The night we found you," he whispered, each word costing him visibly. "Your mother didn't abandon you at our gate." Wren went very still. "She died protecting our queen's last unhatched egg from raiders very much like these," Thal continued. "She was a diplomat, a friend to this mountain long before you were born. She gave her life so that egg would survive, and with her last strength, she carried you to our gate herself, because she trusted us more than she trusted the world she came from to keep you safe." The battle noise around them seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant. "You were never a burden we chose to carry," Thal said, his voice growing fainter. "You were a debt of honor we were desperate to repay. I only ever worried that if I told you too soon, you would spend your whole life feeling like you owed us something, instead of simply letting yourself be loved." His eyes began to close, and Wren, gripping his massive claw in both her hands, felt 17 years of unanswered questions dissolve into a grief too large a moment to hold. "Thal," Wren said, her voice breaking apart around his name, "don't you dare finish that sentence like it's goodbye." She didn't know where the strength came from, only that she refused to let it be won. She called for help in a voice that carried further than she'd ever managed to project in her life. And within moments, Asa was there, and two of the mountain's oldest healers, dragons who had tended wounds since before Wren's mother had ever set foot on that ridge. They worked fast and sure in the mud and torchlight, closing what could be closed, easing what could be eased, while Wren stayed pressed against Thal's side, refusing every gentle suggestion that she step back and let them work. He did not die that night. It took 3 days before anyone could say that with real confidence. 3 days of Wren barely leaving his chamber, sitting beside him through fevered silences and brief, exhausted wakings, telling him things she should have said years earlier and hadn't known how to until she'd nearly lost a chance. By the 4th morning, his breathing had steadied into something that sounded, for the first time since the battle, like the breathing of a creature who intended to keep doing it for a good while longer. The war itself had ended with the warlord's forces broken and scattered back to the foothills, their promised prize of Heartstone never delivered. Their nerve gone the moment they'd watched dragon and human fight and bleed, and carry each other's wounded side by side rather than as separate armies who happened to share a battlefield. Word would later travel far beyond the mountain, carried by merchants and messengers of the night humans and dragons had stood as one line rather than two, and the story would grow a little taller with every retelling, the way true stories often do. Carrot survived his own injuries as well, though what came next for him remained, for a while, an open question. He had betrayed the mountain and nearly cost it everything, and no one, least of all Wren, pretended that could simply be forgiven because he'd shielded two frightened children in the chaos of the very disaster his greed had helped invite. But when the council finally convened to decide his fate, it was Wren who spoke last, and what she asked was not execution, which dragon law permitted, nor imprisonment, which the council favored. She asked for exile, banishment from the mountain, and every settlement it protected, a punishment severe enough to answer betrayal, without asking her to carry the weight of a death on a night. She was trying to build something better than that. The council granted it. Carrick left the mountain 3 days later and was never seen on its slopes again. The third trial was never formally completed, not in the quiet room with old riddles as tradition had always intended. But when the council gathered one final time, Asa rose before any objection could be raised and declared, in a voice that left no room for argument, that no trial devised by the old queens could possibly have tested more thoroughly what Wren was willing to sacrifice for the people of that mountain than the choices she had already made in the mud and fire of that terrible night. The vote that followed was not close. Thal stood at the coronation, weakened still but upright, refusing every suggestion that he rest instead of attend. He stood at Wren's right side as the crown of the old queens, simple silver work etched with symbols older than either species could fully translate anymore, was lowered onto her head before a crowd unlike any the mountain had gathered in living memory. Dragons filled the upper terraces. The villagers from below climbed the mountain path in numbers no one had thought to expect. Farmers and healers and children who had been carried to safety on dragon wings just days before, all of them standing together to watch a girl who had once been left crying in the snow become the first human queen a mountain of dragons had ever chosen for herself. Farron stood near the front with his wing fully healed at last, and when Wren caught his eye across the crowd, he offered the same crooked, unimpressed smile he'd given her from the bottom of a canyon the day they'd met, as if to remind her that some things, at least, hadn't changed no matter how far they'd come since then. When it was her turn to speak, Wren didn't reach for grand words. She simply told them what Thal had given her the strength to finally understand, that she had spent 17 years believing she was something the mountain had chosen to tolerate, when in truth she had been something worth protecting from the very beginning, carried here by a mother whose love had never once been in question, raised by a guardian who had waited patiently for her to become strong enough to carry that truth without breaking under it. She was not a queen despite being human. She was a queen because a human and a dragon had once shown this mountain, on the worst night either species had faced in generations, what it looked like to belong to each other completely. That evening, as the celebration fires burned long into the night and the mountain rang with a kind of laughter it hadn't held in years, Wren climbed once more to the cliff's edge where this had all begun, thou settling slowly beside her the way he had done every morning of her life before that terrible night nearly took him from her. The dragons found you the same night their queen took her final breath, he said quietly, echoing words she hadn't realized he remembered saying to anyone at all. I used to think that was the end of one story. I understand now. It was only the beginning of another. Wren leaned against him, watching the same sunrise she'd watched from this very spot the morning everything began to change, and felt, for the first time in her life, entirely and completely home. If you found your way here, drop a comment telling us which part of Wren's story stayed with you the most. And if you want more stories where humans and dragons choose each other against every odd stacked in front of them, subscribe and stay close, because this mountain has many more stories left to tell.